Hello everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about wave computing, more specifically non-linear wave computing. I titled this video Non-Linear Wave Computing, Vibes, Gestalts, and Realms. And yeah, I mean, essentially I think that wave computing is a component of qualia computing, essentially the way in which our world simulation is constructed and fabricated by our nervous system, managed and edited, elegantly updated and so on. But before I go on to the topic of the day, the qualia of the day is this, I suppose, like a bathroom, unused bathroom mat. And what I really like about it, it has a very cool vibe, a very friendly vibe. To me, it kind of like evokes this kind of like toing, because they're kind of like jiggly. They're kind of like jiggly and very soft. Yeah, I mean, I find it really fun and it's very pleasant to the touch. And as we will see, there's actually a really deep reason why these would have a friendly vibe. So let's get into it. Okay, so break down the title of the video. Non-linear wave computing. Vibes, gestalts, and realms. Okay, so the first component. So like, what are non-linear waves? And we're kind of like sold this story in high school in a sense that what's called the superposition principle applies with waves in general. You have kind of like, if you put like a rock in a lake and another rock in the same lake a couple seconds after, and you see the waves kind of like propagate. The waves, they will kind of like superimpose, but they continue traveling kind of like uninterrupted, in a sense, kind of like they're not interacting with one another, right? Like they can superimpose, and that's totally fine. Now, a lot of waves behave that way. Sound waves within reasonable, energy, what's called the energy regime or the linear energy regime. Most water waves within a reasonable energy regime. Light as well, and so many other like phenomena kind of like follow the superposition principle, but that is not a law of nature that all waves behave that way. And actually, you probably have encountered like non-linear waves in the physical world around you. Like if you've ever been to the beach, there's like this very interesting like phenomenon sometimes where like you have like a confluence of a lot of waves, and sometimes you will see kind of like two large waves kind of they collide with one another. They form this kind of huge column, and then like it's kind of like time symmetric. They decollides and kind of like moves backwards, and like, okay, yeah, that's not the principle of superposition going on there. And the conditions for that, for that particular phenomenon involve, the waves have to be pretty tall. In other words, they have to be highly energized. Essentially, how tall the wave is will be associated with total energy of the wave. And also, it has to be in shallow water. And there's like some interesting interactions that happen there where, all of a sudden the waves become non-linear. And I mean, strictly speaking, waves in water are approximately linear. They're never perfectly linear. And that is because they're not actually perfectly sinusoidal waves. And if you kind of like look at the water molecules, they do a weird movement that it's approximated by sinusoidal waves, but they're not. They're not exactly that. They're something else. Similar to, for example, like, you may think that, like if you take two poles and you put a cord in between and force this kind of like shape, you may say like, that's a parabola. No, it's not a parabola. It's like, it's a catenoid. You see, there's a lot of things like this where like the actual mathematical structure is like slightly different than what it looks like. And those differences may not matter a lot in kind of like the normal, everyday life, room temperature type of existence, but you push it a little bit further and oh my gosh, you start to get like weird effects that like you wouldn't have expected if your intuition was correct. But technically speaking, there's like this whole category of like non-linear phenomena in water, in another medium as well called solitons. And solitons essentially, they're very weird. I mean, like people had observed them in the past. They didn't know what was going on. Essentially, you can be in a lake and all of a sudden you see kind of this blob of water kind of like traveling in a straight line. What is that? It doesn't make any sense. It's like very unusual behavior for a wave, right? They collide, and if they collide, like weird things can happen, almost kind of like as if like particles were colliding. Like it's like a very weird kind of like wave particle like hybrid. I mean, ultimately everything in physics is kind of like that. But yeah, no, okay, so like what's going on with solitons? I mean, like the full technical description would be, its own lecture, but approximately you have essentially a balance of two forces, which is dispersion, essentially how quickly different frequencies, different spacings for the wave travel in the medium. And in water, it turns out, that, small waves actually travel faster than large waves. So that's like dispersion. And then another thing is the nonlinearity of it. And with the soliton, essentially, they just kind of cancel each other out perfectly. And they form these like stable equilibrium that can travel as a unit. It's very, very trippy, isn't it? It's kind of like the fast wave is trying to get advanced, but then like the nonlinearity is pushing it back, and they kind of like are in a perfect balance, and they just travel in kind of like a constant speed that way. But nonlinearities also happen in other places, and something that Stephen Lehar made me aware. And of course, this is a huge topic. It's essentially nonlinear optics. But essentially, if you put two lasers combined in a quartz, or like many other like crystal material, they will form an interference pattern where essentially you're kind of like over-energizing the precise interference pattern of the superposition of those two lasers. And something really weird happens, which is that all of a sudden that intersection point will work as a retroreflector, meaning that if you shine another laser to it, it will reflect not like a mirror, but like a retroreflector. Essentially, these kind of things that you put on your bicycles or like in cars, that wherever you shine the light, it bounces back to you. That happens with like crystals and light. So again, like light is usually like linear in its behavior, but in some mediums it can become very non-linear. Actually, the reason why that happens is that electric fields can change the diffraction of materials. And so a laser, if it gets like strong enough, essentially it is inducing an electric field which will be changing the diffraction the diffraction quotient, or like the diffraction constant of the material. And as a consequence, is going to bend the light. So you have like these weird effects called like self-focusing, for example, where if you shine a laser at a certain energy regime, the laser just goes through no problem. You increase the energy, and all of a sudden it out of focuses, and it focuses in just a point, and it may explode it because it's just such a high temperature. So all of that is non-linear optics, and those are non-linear waves. Now, a metaphor that Stephen Lehar used, which I really, really love, is you can construct systems of essentially combinations of linear waves and non-linear waves in order to compute stuff and represent stuff and do interesting things with that. Of course, there's still relatively little research on how to use this for computation. But what I'm going to be arguing today in this video is that we do that in our consciousness all the time. That actually a lot of what we do is non-linear wave computing. We just don't realize it. But hopefully, as I actually build up the case, you will see, oh my gosh, this actually explains so much about my experience of others, the failure modes of our representations in world simulations. So the metaphor that Stephen Lehar uses is how like rivers carve the sand, kind of like it can carve kind of like sand waves as, it carves a path. And then the sand waves modify the path of the river too. So in that sense, you have two waves interacting. And what the analogy he would make here is that the sand patterns are, in a sense, the non-linearities. And the river would be kind of the linear waves. So, okay, that's hopefully a good kind of a setup for what is a non-linear wave and why it matters. Now, let's get on to the second part of the title, which is vibes, gestalts, and realms. And essentially, I'm going to be arguing that our world simulation is kind of like created out of those components. And, if we kind of like make a metaphor with a house, or like how you might construct a building, vibes may kind of like correspond to the tools with which you construct the house. Then gestalts are kind of the materials, the raw materials, the cement and the bricks and so on. And then the realms would be the entire building that is kind of like hangs together as a coherent self-reinforcing structure. And for that reason, I'm actually going to kind of like go one step at a time and explain how your world simulation is constructed out of nonlinear waves in this way. So first of all, there are various kinds of waves. Okay, so various kinds of waves in your experience. After like a lot of thinking and a lot of, experimentation with my own mind and, yeah, just like talking to other people, but yeah, primarily like experimenting with my mind, I've come to the conclusion that there's actually kind of like three big categories of waves in the nervous system. So there's, first of all, like energetic construction waves, and those are like most, I mean, like that might be like 90%, 95% of them. Like that's the thing that we're mostly acquainted with. And there's like a tremendous diversity of possible kind of like energetic construction waves. The archetypal example for me would be DMT. Like DMT induces these super high energy, vibratory wave patterns in your world simulation, which gives rise to a lot of crazy nonlinearities. And then, it's kind of like the crazy symmetrical objects that you experience on DMT are kind of like the sand directing the waves of energy. And they're kind of like carving each other out. But like most things, like when you listen to music, you're primarily kind of engaged with kind of like, energetic constructive waves, and so on. Like that's the most common. There's also, a second kind, which is dark night of the soul waves. And, this seems like very out there, but actually, like adept meditators will say that like, well, in Buddhism, they might say something like the 10,000 universes in a single second or something like that, which is that, like, even though, most of your experience is predominantly created out of like a particular kind of like raw, material or raw tool, which would be like the energetic construction waves, there's always like a little bit of an element of the other things. It's just like that the dose is like sufficiently low that you don't really pay attention to it, you don't reify it, you don't realize it's there. And the dark night of the soul type waves are essentially deconstructing, and the kind of closest phenomenology that most people might associate with this is kind of like restlessness. In the extreme case, you have restless legs as well as akathisia, withdrawal from like various kinds of drugs, breakups. Like a breakup will be full, like a romantic breakup, whatever it may be, grieving will be full of these kind of waves. And what they feel like is that it essentially they deconstruct as opposed to like add up. So essentially when they collide, they kind of create these like unpleasant vacuum where the waves kind of like get deconstructed. And I mean, a lot of like kind of a dark night experience is like you're kind of like dislodging patterns ingrained in your experience. You're dislodging the nonlinearities that are creating your experience, and you kind of like have to wait for them to naturally shake themselves apart. And so that's a whole category. And then there's like the third one, which is like the hardest to describe. But these are like equanimity waves, and they're so weird. And okay, so 5-MeO-DMT would be, I think, like the substance that gives you like really strong access to all three waves at once, all three kinds of waves, but especially equanimity waves, and secondarily dark night waves. I mean, a lot of the time a 5-MeO-DMT experience will be kind of like really unpleasant because it's deconstructing your model of the world, essentially the nonlinearities that make it up. But the good part of a 5-MeO-DMT experience, which is this beautiful kind of transcendent outside, almost kind of like outside time of space, like pure consciousness, openness that just receives and accepts and embraces and lets be absolutely whatever happens, those would be equanimity waves. And I mean, phenomenologically, the way I might describe it is something like kind of like a space-time gravity wave. Is like when you have two black holes that are like circling each other and they're close to colliding, and they're sending these space-time waves. Why? Because you have this front of kind of like accelerated space-time, and then like this like stretching of like dilated space-time. And equanimity waves kind of have that quality. It's kind of like this wave that just kind of allows anything to happen, and it increases the amount of consciousness that you're having, but at the same time it's kind of like a weird nothingness, a strange void that kind of like can swallow anything, no matter how unpleasant. And if you could generate arbitrary amounts of that, you would be set. I mean, like, for example, the whole thrust of the philosophy of Shanzen Young and some other Buddhists is like, if you can boost equanimity all the way, you could experience absolutely horrific, unpleasant, emotional, bodily, cognitive dysphoria, and it's fine because the equanimity will kind of absorb that stress. Equanimity is an incredibly powerful stress dissipation engine, as it were. Although it's not an engine because it's not a thing in any traditional way. It's kind of space-time wave. Weird stuff, but definitely real. So it's important to pay attention to it. Okay, so those are kind of like the three kinds of waves. I will mostly be speaking of the first one because the other two are like kind of like not that common, and also I still find them very mysterious in many ways. But I think I have a fairly good handle on like the first kind, which is energetic, constructive kind of waves. So essentially, it seems to me, and also rhythms in the brain. There's like several books that kind of argue these. Also, I've got to say, not only Stephen Lehar, but also like Stephen Grossberg kind of like has kind of this generalized concept of resonance. That is, resonance, we tend to think only in terms of kind of like superposition of linear waves. When you pluck a string in a guitar or like in a piano, essentially the waves are like fairly linear and the harmonics don't interfere with one another. But that is not the case for every kind of medium. And like if you read QRI content thinking like we're only talking about resonance in the linear way, you're actually gonna like miss out on actually the more juicy stuff that we're proposing, which is actually the nonlinearities are kind of really essential to understand it all. So resonance is essentially like are oftentimes when you have some kind of nonlinearity interacting with a linear wave in a stable fashion. I mean, similar to a soliton. Here is where you get the vibes. So what is a vibe? I mean, vibes are real. Vibes are real. I mean, like they're like obviously a very important part of your experience. And as I said, a very soft, kind of cushion will have a certain vibe that is very different than if you have kind of like, like punk kind of like spiky kind of decorations that are like, scary and like high frequency with pinch points. That's a very different vibe. So this section I titled essentially vibe fundamentals. So essentially there's like several things, from the symmetry theory of valence proposed by Mike Johnson, and especially, the concept of valence structuralism that he proposed in Principia Qualia. Essentially, you have this, this kind of like insight that like the thing that makes your experience feel good or bad has to do with the structure of your experience. So to a first approximation, what determines the vibe is the shape of the waves that are traveling in your nervous system and how they're traveling. So it's both their shape and how they're traveling. And to a first approximation, the smoother the medium is, like the more symmetrical, the more smooth the geometry is, the higher the valence is going to be, the more pleasant it's going to be. This quality of softness. And essentially Klein, mathematician famous for his Klein bottles, he also kind of like formalized the concept of geometry in terms of symmetries. And I'll put a link in the comments in the description. But essentially, you can kind of characterize a geometric space in terms of like what symmetrical transformations or what transformations there are that leave, properties the same. And essentially, when you're kind of like in a yoga retreat or, loving kindness or highly concentrated states and things like that, your phenomenal body is going, your phenomenal energy body is going to be very smooth, and so the waves are going to travel in an uninterrupted way, and as a consequence, they're not going to lose energy as they do so. Essentially, there's kind of some energy preservation effect in there, and they're not going to change their shape either. To a first approximation, how pleasant a vibe is will have to do with just how smooth, symmetrical, and geometrically regular is the medium within which it travels, and how regular the shapes of the waves are. In contrast, the things that make a vibe unpleasant are essentially symmetry breaking operations in it. And, in kind of the most abstract way, here's a awesome diagram. So essentially, this is kind of like a hierarchy of symmetries. So like at the top, you have a square that has all of the possible symmetries of a quadrangular. But as you kind of like break symmetries, this one is interesting. It's kind of like you're breaking the rotational symmetry. Like, maybe it only rotates in one direction. So like maybe the square, like, it's the same in this way, but this one only in one direction. So that's kind of a weird, almost kind of invisible way of breaking the symmetry. But it's definitely important mathematically. But there's like other ways, right? You can like squish it and like, oh, okay, now that you have like a rhombus, or like a rectangle. And like those have like different symmetry elements, different possible transformations that will leave it the same. And essentially, with every symmetry breaking operation that you add to it, it becomes more and more irregular, all the way until it's completely irregular. And so again, yeah, to a first approximation, the more irregular it is, the more unpleasant it's going to be. The vibes, essentially, of these things. Why? Because, yeah, I mean, when you're representing this square, it is going to be this combination of kind of like the nonlinearities that are like creating the, you know, the borders and the limitations, which are going to be sending waves of energy to the rest of your experience. And if this is a perfectly symmetrical thing, those waves of energy will actually be regular. So I know that's kind of crazy to contemplate, but yeah, I mean, to a first approximation, how much, you know, negative valence you're experiencing is going to be kind of like a weighted score of how many pinch points this kind of like medium of wave propagation has, how many shears, essentially how many areas where kind of the you have like some discontinuities, or you have like some stress in a, you know, symmetrically broken way that essentially kind of dephases that structure. Or blocks, I mean, outright blocks, like the regions through which like the waves don't travel. And very similarly, or like very relatively, reflectors, like parts where like the wave travels and just reflects back. So like if you're having like a stomach upset or something like that, or like a knee pain or whatever it may be, introspect on that. Like you will realize like how unpleasant that sensation is approximated by, yeah, how many pinch points, how many blockages, you know, how many shears and how many reflectors of the waves of energy it contains. And all of these, yeah, kind of like aggregates to essentially how much like stress and strain is being generated in your entire system. Importantly, like whenever you have kind of like a nonlinear structure that you're generating, anything you're representing, the vibe of that thing will essentially be the frequencies of the vibe will be related in an inverse way to the distances of it. So consider like if you have a very long tube that you're representing in your mind, that is going to be emitting essentially several kinds of vibes. First of all, you will have kind of like a harmonic resonance structure vertically, which is going to be a very low frequency. It's kind of like, ooh, kind of like a long tube. But then also, like, there's going to be waves across it, you know, like in the thickness of it. And if it's kind of like a you know, a thin sheet, like sure, it's very long, but if it's very thin, that is going to be a very high frequency component. So if you have a long sheet, essentially it's going to have like both a low frequency and a high frequency component. So essentially it's kind of like a Fourier transform of all of these, you know, nonlinear structures that you're representing. That is going to be kind of like the vibe generators in your experience. And so, yeah, we're kind of like starting to kind of like see some elements to like understand and decipher the vibe of this, essentially. Oh, and this, by the way, is an insight by Stephen Lehar, that, yeah, essentially there's kind of this inverse relationship between the distance and the frequency for kind of like generating like waves. And now, of course, like I'm talking about it in terms of vibes because I care about valence, and valence is intimately related to vibes. I don't think Stephen Lehar cared that much about valence, or he was not paying attention to it. But yeah, I mean, Mike and I and others at QRI, that's what we study. We're very, very interested in that. So now let's get into like actually like kind of the kind of like subtle details about vibes. So kind of like in a more advanced understanding here, it's not only the frequencies that matter, you know, the Fourier decomposition. The other thing that matters too is the what's called the attack, decay, sustain, and release of these waves. So essentially you kind of like have this pattern, and like basically how high it goes and how long this takes. So this is the attack, this is the decay, this is the sustain, and this is the release. And you know, like what makes the sounds of different musical instruments different is not only, you know, the distribution of energy across its harmonics, it's also the attack, decay, sustain, release of the notes. And you know, it's one of these puzzling things, right? Because okay, like this is happening over time. Presumably your ear only has access to like just one point of it at a time, right? But obviously we're integrating that information over time and generating a representation that simultaneously contains temporal, you know, information. It's kind of like temporal coding. So in that sense, yeah, all of this is kind of like being compressed. And I think like actually this is being translated into kind of like the shape of the waves propagating in your world simulation. So it's kind of like, what does these wave front look like, right? Is this kind of like a sharp attack? Like there's like nothing here and then all of a sudden it gets really high energy? Or is it something kind of like softer where like, oh, like it kind of like has kind of like a warning. It's kind of like, oh, it's getting and then it happens. Okay, so that would be a kind of like a soft attack. Okay, so to a first approximation, more friendly vibes will have friendly attacks, which is they will have kind of like a friendly ramp up of energy, as opposed to kind of like a shockwave that, you know, just kind of like hits all of you at once. So and very unfriendly energies will be just full of, you know, kind of like shockwaves that are like destructive, as opposed to kind of like trying to harmonize or merge the energies, as it were. And I mean, I recommend like watching the presentation on the psychophysics toolkit at the QRI channel, the tracer tool, because yeah, we're essentially trying to characterize the tracer effects of psychedelics in terms of things such as the attack, decay, sustained release of the tracers. And as I'll explain, I do actually think this is very different from one drug to another and from one mindset to another. So let's get into kind of like some concrete examples of vibes. So for example, in Pikal, the book by Alexander Shulgin, yeah, I mean, essentially he talks about like how LSD in his, you know, in his own book, in his own book literally, is kind of like a pushy, is like a very pushy type of drug relative to other psychedelics of that like general class. And yeah, it's kind of like, it kind of like overwhelms you and like cuts your thoughts, and it has like kind of this kind of pushy quality. Now, I think that's true in like substantial doses. In small doses, a lot of people actually talk about LSD as like fairly like soft and relaxing. So I think it's probably dose dependent. Obviously, also genetic, you know, differences will result in kind of like different, you know, vibes for each drug. But yeah, I mean, to a first approximation, what I would say though is that there are drugs that are like way worse in this domain, and I would say like pretty much any psychedelic amphetamine, for example, like DOB or DOC, DOI, those like drugs that like probably are like super cardiotoxic, are super stimulating, like very steamy and tensing, and also they last a long time and they make you crash really bad. So I don't actually understand why anybody would take those drugs, but those are like harsh in their vibe. Essentially, they are kind of like this like electric kind of like harsh, this high attack kind of like tensing type of vibe. In contrast, MDMA, I mean, especially like pure MDMA, like not, you know, MDMA plus MDA or MDMA plus methamphetamine or anything. No, it's just pure, unadulterated MDMA generally has an incredibly beautiful, soft vibe. I mean, people say they didn't know love existed until they experienced MDMA, or didn't know it existed to such an extent. So and I'll get back into it when we talk about the Gestalts and realms, but essentially, yeah, MDMA, that vibe kind of like constructs an entire world that is made of that. And so it's not only that like, yeah, it creates these beautiful waves with extreme softness, also ultimately it's kind of like they compound and they create a world made of love. Not pushy at all, not pushy at all, not pushy at all. And also there's this weird effect, like Nistigamas, for example, on MDMA. I think I can do it. I'm not on MDMA, but some people can do it. It's kind of like tense your eye and your eyes kind of vibrate. So like that happens, but like involuntarily. And like sometimes it's kind of like difficult to see clearly because you're kind of vibrating in that way. Now on MDMA, like that's not a particularly unpleasant thing. And what Stephen Lehar actually says is that like that is not only happening in your eyes. Like if you pay attention in MDMA, like all your nervous system kind of like does that. It's kind of like these like cascades where like it's kind of like vibrating like that, like dithering. And in high doses, it's actually constant. And that dithering, it smooths out the contents of your representation. So it's kind of like you're superimposing an element of your internal world simulation with itself, with a little kind of like dephase, with a soft attack, decay, sustained release envelope. And as a consequence, you're softifying, you're making everything soft. everything becomes soft. Everything becomes soft. And I think that explains a lot the vibe of MDMA. Ketamine is and dissociatives are kind of like very strange and difficult to explain to a first approximation. I think that a lot of what is going on with these substances is that essentially they slow down the speed of wave propagation in your nervous system across the board. But I think there's also like some exotic nonlinearities that arise as well. Essentially, they may kind of like modify the dispersion equation, for example. Like, it's not only that they slow down all waves, but like they probably slow down some waves more than others. And similar to kind of like a soliton in water, yeah, there are like solitons of experience on ketamine that are just not possible to experience otherwise. Because, yeah, they're changing the wave propagation dynamics, and some nonlinearities can compound into solitons. And I think that explains a lot. I mean, like people, yeah, there's kind of like this quality of space-time that can become like gel, for example, like other states of matter. Like space-time acquires like other phases. I think like that's, yeah, like you're creating this like soliton of space-time, and it's very, very different. And of course, all of this is completely testable in the end. I mean, as I said, like the tracer tool is just getting into the attack decay sustained release envelope of psychedelics. But I think we can also test, yeah, the change in the wave propagation dynamics on ketamine with like appropriate neuroimaging and the right psychophysical tasks. So, you know, sure, this is speculative and based on kind of like, you know, an intelligent exploration of like high quality truth reports and a lot of conversations. But ultimately, yeah, this is like, you know, scientifically testable. And I think it's going to advance our understanding. Equanimity. Equanimity is like a very special vibe. I was saying that, you know, it's kind of like its own category. Roughly speaking, it de-energizes. So like it de-energizes whatever nonlinearity you may have. It doesn't feed it. And one of the crazy things though is that we think that this is a bug in our mind, or maybe a feature for evolutionary reasons, having to do with the selfish gene. But essentially, yeah, we think that thinking about something might solve it, but actually thinking about something usually energizes those representations. So when you obsessively think about something, you're creating this very, very, very robust and resilient, anti-fragile kind of a representation. And equanimity will de-energize it, kind of like slowly defabricate it. And yeah, like MDMA is similar to loving kindness as well, although I would say loving kindness does it without the dithering component. Loving kindness is kind of like just, you know, the attack, decay, sustained release of the waves that you're kind of like kindling on meditation. They have, yeah, just very soft properties, how they build onto each other. They form non-linearities, and those non-linearities are very soft and beautiful themselves, and you can use them to generate vibe. And in a sense, it's a bootstrapping process, right? Like you start with like a tiny spark. You know, I've heard like some meditators say like, you know, I could transform my entire experience into a world of metta by just focusing on a tiny pleasant sensation on my thumb. It's kind of like, yes, you kind of focus on that and just like slowly grow it and grow it and grow it. And over hours of patient work, it grows and grows. And eventually, yeah, it's just all of your experience. Finally, yeah, in terms of kind of like concrete examples, dopaminergic drugs, my understanding is that kind of like align the direction along which waves propagate, so they can make you very task focused, as it were. Serotonergics, they tend to a first approximation modify the attack, decay, sustained release. And adrenergics, essentially things that like increase, you know, adrenaline and like make you like stressed and anxious. You know, they can energize you, and like energizing in and of itself can be positive for your valence for a lot of reasons, including annealing effects. But also, you know, the first approximation, I think, like that the kind of vibe that adrenergics generate is intrinsically slightly dissonant. I mean, it's kind of like introducing a source of energy that is like slightly harsh. And like, again, that can be a net positive in some situations. It's usually not a net positive on like a sufficiently high dose. I mean, like if you like 1 cup of coffee, I bet you're not gonna like 8 cups of coffee all at once. Like there's obviously a limit. And like at that point, it's just like, okay, yeah, this is actually just very harsh and unpleasant. And essentially, yeah, when you have like harsh and unpleasant sources of vibes in your nervous system, that kind of like will corrupt the rest of the vibe in your experience. So, I mean, like, I don't think like doing like really high-end like loving kindness meditation is really easy if you're like really wired on like on coffee, you know, or ephedrine or whatever, like any of those kind of things in that category. Okay, and finally, as an example, 5-MeO DMT. I would think there's kind of like ace in the hole, you know, the ultimate deconstructor, you know, because it's like sending these waves of equanimity. The vibe is one where like it just doesn't energize any of your pre-existing representations. So like, what is there to do? Well, you embrace those waves of energy, you become them, which is kind of like becoming pure consciousness in a way. And then also simultaneously, you it kind of like deconstructs and like de-energizes everything else. Okay, so there's that. Now, kind of like applied. I don't think, you know, this is also to a first approximation, but I think like there was like this fascinating study of like the principal component analysis of like a large data set of smells and like what their properties are and what people associate them with. That yeah, kind of like showed that there are like some major axes. And what is two like very important axes is like how feminine the perfume smells and how masculine it smells. And what they found is like that to a first approximation, like that's very well predicted by essentially you know, masculinity is kind of like how energizing it is, which would be kind of like correspond with the arousal axis in the core affect space, whereas femininity or like, you know, feminine smells would correspond to with how like immediately pleasant and sweet the smell is. I mean, and of course you can have both. You can have like very highly energizing and sweet, but you see, vibes can have like this property. You can have a vibe that is just about like energy, adding energy, and another vibe that is just about kind of like adding joy and kind of like building a beautiful, yeah, very pleasant like environment to live in, but not necessarily kind of like go out and do a bunch of things. Okay, so that would be kind of like an interesting descriptor. I mean, I'm not saying this is, you know, universal like and the case for everybody or anything of the sort, but there's probably something to that. I do like this thought from Martinus, which is a mystic from Denmark. A friend of mine introduced him to me, and he essentially believes that like masculinity and femininity have to do with some kind of like polarity in your energy body, and that essentially over time, as we progress spiritually, okay, in that, you know, the tradition where people believe that we reincarnate and life is a trial where we improve our spirit and so on and so forth. Yeah, what they're saying is that essentially over time we will become more and more bipolar. Essentially we'll have both kind of the feminine and the masculine component. I don't know. I mean, it would be fun to think about it. David Pierce also says something like, yeah, I mean, in the long run, I mean, when we're talking about like full spectrum super intelligences, like essentially gender will go the same way as, you know, the horns and tail. Like, yeah, just kind of like an appendage that, yeah, doesn't, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like limiting, if anything. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to kind of like mention that. I'll also mention like all of this is quite related, although Mike didn't talk about nonlinearities in his piece, but essentially there's this piece he wrote called A Future for Neuroscience. And yeah, essentially he talks about like these two kind of like possible quotients for a person's nervous system. One of them is the Metronome Quotient, which is kind of like how they organize the resonances in order to project them into the world. And essentially, yeah, people who are like very good at metronome, you know, quotient are going to be, yeah, basically good at kind of like being a newscaster or like being an actor or kind of like essentially, yeah, or a musician, kind of like projecting their own vibe. And if their own vibe is really pleasant and kind of like mind music for others, that might be really popular. And then you have Entrainment Quotient, which is kind of like what is your sensitivity to other person's vibes, how easily you coupled into them. And yeah, there's probably also a little bit of kind of like a gender like effect here, where like very masculine vibes tend to be like more kind of in the Metronome Quotient, and very feminine vibes tend to be very much in the Entrainment Quotient. But again, I suspect this is a like relatively small effect size, but yeah, it's worth pointing out. It's kind of like an interesting pattern to observe here. Yeah, okay, so there's that. Now, let's get onto Gestalts. And to do that, essentially, yeah, let's revisit briefly, you know, something that I talked about in another video. I also have an article called Buddhist Annealing, which is like, yeah, how like the 7 factors of awakening kind of like are playing with the energy flux in your experience. And it's kind of like you're using those factors in order to kind of like weld those energies usually in the direction of harmonization and defabrication, which is kind of like the spiritual path. I would say that essentially something like an adrenergic drug can have this unpleasant side effect, which is that because it generates this like harsh vibe, essentially you start to create kind of like a lot of internal nonlinear constructs based on that harsh vibe. And in the extreme case, that can like motivate for example, like power posing. So like what is power posing, and why do I think it's actually not very helpful? So there was a lot of probably not replicated research on people who were like, if you kind of like make a power pose before an interview or something, you'll be like more assertive or something like that, and you may get the job or you may get the race, whatever it may be. I think that's actually not a good idea, because when you're doing that, you're essentially energizing kind of this like tense pattern inside you that is an ego construct, but is not actually backed up by the value that you can provide, right? It's an act. And because it's an act, it kind of has this like shadow to it, which is there's nothing to back it up. And I think like in the extremes where you talk about like narcissism, for example, a person is just like, essentially they created this shell created of these like, nonlinear structures, egoic structures. All of them are like power posing. And they're just so focused on that. Anybody pokes at them, it feels like the world is collapsing, literally, because actually, this like, second skin, kind of like shell of ego projection is like being, you're getting through to them with maybe like truth or something like that. And that can be really unpleasant. Like the breakdown of that second shell can be really unpleasant. So, like kind of like if you're in that mindset, you may kind of like lash out, or you may, become aggressive or threatening if somebody pokes at it. And that's, I think like very, very counterproductive. And for sure, like, I don't think social media is helping me here. I mean, essentially social media is getting people to create a second skin, right? Because like with everything that you put in there, especially if it's not something that you're like actually legitimately, proud of, you put in a bunch of work in, is like helpful and valuable. Essentially, you're getting social validation for all sorts of like kind of like random things. And for sure, your brain is going to pay attention to it. It's going to create kind of this slight nonlinearity that is going to kind of like stick with you. And all of a sudden you're made of kind of like, it's kind of like full of stickers. That person who's like full of stickers and their personality, they're struggling to maintain their personality. I don't think it's very healthy necessarily. I'm not against, social media and abstract, actually. I think it's, besides, its addictiveness and ego effects, I've met so many fascinatingly brilliant and interesting people through social media. So like, I actually don't condemn it in general, and especially for intellectual work. Ironically, it's actually really, really positive. And I think so many cool communities wouldn't exist without it. So anyway, let's get into Gestalts. So Gestalts are essentially what vibes are constructing. So when you're kind of like, using these kind of like energized like waves and you're generating nonlinearities, when you construct a scene, that would be a Gestalt. And essentially, people like, Grossberg and Stephen Lehar and a lot of like, visual perception research focuses on Gestalt, essentially kind of like where all of the elements of the scene pop into becoming more than the sum of the parts. So what is that? Well, that is a resonance phenomenon. It always is a resonance phenomenon, but it's a non-linear resonance phenomenon. Essentially, you're having kind of the elements of the scene are emitting their own vibe. And when you get a Gestalt, what you're doing is that all of those vibes are getting interlocked. They're phase locked and they click into place. And that's a Gestalt. And essentially the Gestalts, we think of it as kind of like a snapshot of experience, but they're actually, I think, like a little bit more interesting than that. I would say that Gestalts are kind of like propositional. They're like scenes or sentences or situations. And that's how we reason. I think our brain like reasons through, sentences, for example, like not only there's like something, that something is also doing something. And that is the thing that you're capturing. That is like the full Gestalt and its vibe. And like a story is like stringing of, action-based Gestalts together to form, a continuous, I guess like movie or set of actions. And all of those Gestalts are actually like, in resonance. And, ultimately when you create the movie or something like that, they form kind of like a macro structure that itself is in kind of like a resonance configuration. So I guess like that's those are Gestalts. So I'll say for a lot of Gestalts, I mean, especially like if you're kind of like studying a technical field or philosophy or whatever it may be, I would say like they are kind of like a search process, and like they're actually a very interesting search process. And the search process is using wave computing. You know, it's not a standard. I mean, of course you could emulate it with a Turing machine, but yeah, the runtime complexity will be off. And actually, you're completely missing the point. Like if you think that you know, a digital computer will do this. I mean, yes, of course you could simulate it with a digital computer, but you're missing out on being able to use the medium, the physical medium, to kind of do a lot of the work for you. Like in a previous video recently, I talked about how intelligence is all about figuring out a self-organizing principle that will solve the problem for you. You know, this is what we're talking about. It's like recruiting the appropriate wave propagation mediums that will, in a sense, when interacting with one another, generate a gestalt that is creating a representation that allows you to solve a problem for you. Also, I mean, importantly, from a physical point of view, every gestalt is going to be a local energy minima. And that's just like by design. I mean, essentially, oscillatory synchrony is energetically cheap. Exactly the same principle for like why soap bubbles become spherical, because when they're not spherical, you know, they're going to be wobbling and they will be radiating energy around them. So like they will fall into their local energy minima. Gestalts are local energy minima because they're resonant configurations. But again, they're nonlinear resonant configurations. And, you know, to find or understand a gestalt, and I think a lot of like, yeah, our reasoning, our thinking, even like how we make sense of, you know, high level structures of the worlds, like, you know, countries or like, you know, processes, like, yeah, even like very abstract processes like annealing and things like that. Actually, these are like fairly subtle gestalts that you need to kind of like fine tune so they serve the purpose that you want. And the process of doing that is kind of like essentially looking at an autostereogram where you have like a magic eye, essentially. So, you know, a magic eye, I have it here. So these kind of like shapes, I don't know, you will be able to do it through the, but you can just Google magic eye, essentially. Yeah, I mean, essentially the whole texture is the same. I talked about like how like there is one level of DMT experience that is full of magic eye phenomenology. Yes, actually, because like, again, like you're in a highly energized state of consciousness and the local minima will be the gestalts made of magic eyes, depth maps, essentially. But he's sort of like this. I think actually this is a metaphor that Daniel Ingram used to refer to meditation states, like jhanas and things like that. That like, yeah, it's kind of like for a while you're kind of like, you're doing a lot of work and the things don't match, they don't match. Maybe you get a bit of a glimpse at once and then like some features kind of like assemble and like, but it takes a while and then all of a sudden, wow, like the whole thing assembles. Like essentially it's a bootstrapping process because once you get kind of like more than 50%, say, I don't know the precise percentage, but it would be something like that. There's the threshold, like percentage of it being figured out. It makes the rest very easy to figure out. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, climbing uphill and then, you know, sliding downhill. So a lot of the process of kind of like gestalt generation will kind of like look like this. Like if this is the, this is the time axis and this is the, how much you get it. Like, do you get it? Do you get it? Like, don't you get it? It's going to be something like this. It's going to be like, yeah, at first you don't get it at all, right? And then you kind of like, oh, wow, there's a little bit of a hint. Wow, a little bit more of a hint. Wow, a larger hint. And then, wow, now I get it. Oh, it goes out. Like, oh, I get it again. Oh, it goes out. Oh, I get it again. And then it stabilizes. It's going to look kind of like that. Like the process of constructing a gestalt. Essentially, yeah, you're kind of like trying to find this like low energy attractor that satisfies all these constraints. Vibe computing, nonlinear wave computing. Okay, so those are gestalts. Now, again, those are kind of like the bricks, you know, the raw materials. Again, you're constructing them with sets of vibes, but then the gestalts are things that once you get them, once you stabilize them and construct them, you can use to build something else. Now, importantly, the vibe that you use to construct a gestalt is going to leave an imprint in the valence of that gestalt. So essentially, yeah, if you're imagining of a cartoon villain or like a monster or something like that, the gestalt that you're imagining is going to have like harsh properties. I mean, like again, like it's very spiky kind of like configurations, those are going to be emitting very harsh, unpleasant vibes. And so like essentially every Gestalt will have its own what we call at QRI, its own consonance, dissonance, and noise signature. And that's kind of incredible. And I think what I'm gonna say next is realms, essentially the realms of experience. My claim is that essentially they are collections of Gestalts that are self-reinforcing. And essentially there's various attractors. And of course, like eventually, scientifically, we will figure out precisely what those attractors are. But in the meantime, we can actually talk about them, in light of kind of like Buddhist, the Buddhist realms. And there's like 10 Buddhist realms. I mean, there's 6 for most people think of them as 6, but there's kind of like expanded lists. And I also like the 10 version. Yeah, I mean, essentially, in order to construct a Gestalt, a realm, that's another graph I'll have to make. It's essentially, there are 2 forces at play. One is, essentially like the y-axis here is going to be kind of like your pre-existing like level of like fabrication, like how fabricated your experience is. And that is going to be how many nonlinearities you have stored, essentially. How many Gestalts do you contain in you? I mean, and you're going to be saving every Gestalt that you generate gets saved into your subconscious. Storehouse consciousness, as they call it in Buddhism. Yeah, there's a ton. And like if you generate a particular Gestalt, it will have a vibe and a mood. And you may forget about it, but someday, like, okay, randomly you're dreaming and like, wow, that mood I had never experienced since I was 4 years old when I saw that clown. Like that sort of thing happens. Or I went to, I don't know, that museum. Just got a fun memory. Yeah, like that, they will have their unique kind of consonance, dissonance, noise signatures. So essentially, a particular realm, it's an antifragile structure made of a lot of Gestalts interacting with one another. So the x-axis here is like the rate of like fabrication, and here's the rate of defabrication. So most realms essentially kind of like exist here, like essentially when the world is already pretty fabricated. Like when you're like here, like when there's like just nothing being fabricated, that would be kind of like Nirodha Samapatti, essentially these like peak awakening states where just like absolutely nothing or pure consciousness. But most people are going to be in like some kind of like antifragile realm or another. So essentially when you're like here, you're like moving very fast upwards. So like when you have like a very high rate of like fabrication, whereas when you're here, you're going to be moving slowly. And when you're like defabricating, where like the net homeostasis of like how much you're fabricating versus how much you're defabricating is here, you will be going very slowly. And essentially, you will go very, very, very fast, kind of like defabricating. So if you take 5-MeO-DMT, especially like, let's say like a small therapeutic dose to deal with that trauma or something like that, the trauma will come up and then it will be kind of like shaking itself apart and defabricating. So that might be here, like, okay, you're like really traumatized. So there's like a lot of self-reinforcing fabrications. 5-MeO-DMT, like that's going to start to defabricate really quickly. But it may not go all the way down, right? Like after the session, like maybe you will be here. You might need like several more sessions to kind of like slowly get you below the threshold where the realm stops to being antifragile. And you can finally exit that realm. The thing is, like, if you don't go there, the realm may start to like refabricate itself because it's antifragile. And like that's the whole phenomenon of a re-traumatization. Like talk therapy can actually like make something worse, or psychedelic therapy. You can actually refabricate a trauma that you already dealt with if it has like the seeds of it, and you're not skilled enough, or like you're too stressed. If you're too stressed, that also can happen. It doesn't need to be a moral thing. If you have too much adrenergic or like some medical problem, that will energize those representations, and you can again. There's a lot of kind of like moralistic thinking, I think, when it comes to like how these things work. But no, I think like there's a lot of just like, very basic physiological things that we can ideally, be able to hack at some point. But okay, so like what are the realms? What are kind of like these like antifragile attractors? So essentially, we can start with a hungry ghost. And a hungry ghost is kind of, this feeling of like frustration and that you never feel satiated. Michael Taft, in a meditation about this, was saying like, in the Pirates of the Caribbean, when like there all of these ghost pirates. They're like eating a feast, but they're all made of bones, and the food just kind of goes through them. Yeah, it's like you have intense cravings, but they don't satisfy. So cravings essentially is a certain kind of gestalt that has these like pulling and tightness quality. And Robert Bia essentially says that, yeah, if you introspect in meditation on your energy body and a craving comes up, you will realize that the intensity of the craving is directly proportional to the tension and the contraction in your energy body. So yeah, there's a duality there, and that generates a gestalt. And then, so that's kind of like how you represent the world, the things that happen to you. Another thing about realms, I think, is what I would call the core of a realm, which is essentially how you conceptualize your sense of self, how you interpret reality, what kind of lens you have when you're in that realm. And yeah, I mean, when you're a hungry ghost, essentially, it's kind of like within your sense of self, which we can visualize as kind of a sphere, as it were, is depressed, is depressurized. So there's kind of like this feeling of like it needs something external to fill it up, and it's always kind of like half full, and that's pretty unpleasant. You will also notice, like in meditation, that like there's essentially this correspondence between kind of like the core, or kind of like the sense of self, and your sense of like the external environment, and there's this what they call co-arising, and I think that's very much true. I mean, it has to do with these non-linear wave dynamics, actually, because for you to actually energize an external representation, you need kind of like an internal source that will be emitting the vibes that will generate that. So you think of the cores as kind of the vibe emitters, the primary vibe emitter. And if you're like really upset, your primary vibe emitter is going to be like this harsh wave, which essentially takes us to the hell realm. So essentially in the hell realm is a anti-fragile attractor of dissonant gestalts, essentially gestalts that like energize each other, and they're all unpleasant. And that's like one of the very sad things about the failure modes of our nervous system, is that there is no end to hell. I mean, you can make hells even more. Well, I'm sure there's a worst possible hell given a particular nervous system, but it's unfathomably worse than what you can imagine. So, whenever there's like a tricky situation, you have to think not only like how do I solve it, but also how do I prevent it from getting worse, because it can be 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times worse, and we usually we're not very cognizant of that fact. So that's a hell realm. And I mean, the kind of like core is kind of like this like self-repeating loop of it's my fault, or it's the world's fault, the world is horrible. And the thing is like, yeah, if you approach every situation with that vibe emitter, you're going to slowly be kindling and turning into a hell world as well. So that's also, one of the reasons it's so difficult to get out of it. And like in many cases, to get out of hell, you might need kind of like a small period of, no pain and no disturbance, so you can kind of like be stable that way. And bootstrap, I mean, as I said, like a meditator might say like, yeah, everything felt bad in my body, but as long as I had a spark of loving kindness in a tiny part of my body, you can just focus on that. Don't focus on the frustration. Don't focus on the things that are, tense. Focus on the parts that are relaxed of your experience, and then try to build those. That is apparently really effective. I mean, I find it effective, but if you do it a lot in retreat, then you can enter like these beautiful, hyper-relaxed states of consciousness. What else? Well, we have the Titans, also the world of Asuras, the jealous gods. Essentially, they feel everything as an attack. It's unpleasant, but essentially is attack heavy, kind of very kinetic. And the vibes of it are these very sharp attacks, essentially like things like actually hit, like internal representations have like you're blasting them as opposed to like softly, gently interacting with them. I mean, they kind of like erase information, and unfortunately, I would say kind of like war aesthetics and things like that. The kind of like times that we live in, they're like full of that realm, which is really unfortunate, and it's anti-fragile, and we've got to figure out how to disable it, essentially. And I think like, with something like understanding how to disable it with nonlinear wave dynamics is probably pretty helpful. I think I'm very optimistic that might be a way. Now, the core, the internal who you are when you are in the Titan world, what's inside you, it's actually a kind of like weapon depot. It's kind of like all of these like non-linear gestalts that you have assembled that are like strong and powerful and can destroy things. You can point it at things. and will emit a harsh vibe in that direction. And there's like some degree of controllability of it. Like in the hell realm is uncontrollable, and it's just, you know, they work on their own. In the Titan realm, there's some degree of controllability, except that of course like the controllability itself is like driven by emotions that are hard to control. So okay, like how voluntary it is kind of up to debate. But yeah, so that's the Titan realm in this paradigm. Then you have the animal realm. You kind of like ignorance. You just kind of want to veg out and forget about everything, just kind of be in a cozy place, and, you know, simple pleasures, immediate gratifications. So that realm is, I would describe it as like very sticky. So the vibe is actually kind of has like this like sticky, almost kind of like slimy quality. Like you want to kind of like find like a cozy part of your experience and just kind of veg out in it. And it is not very energized, and it's not very intelligent. It's kind of sleepy. It's dumb. It's soporiferous. It lacks the activation energy to get out of it. And obviously, yeah, a lot of things can put us in that attractor, kind of like, yeah, attached with a small pressure. And essentially, what is inside you? What is the core when you're in the animal realm? It's essentially a collection of like petty likes and dislikes. It's like, oh, I like this warmth. I don't like this cold. I like this. I don't like that. And it doesn't go like much more. It's not more interesting than that. Is the sort of thing that, yeah, for sure, like a fish probably experiences in the core. Well, depends on the fish and the circumstance. Probably a bad metaphor. But yeah, so that would be kind of the animal realm. Then the human realm essentially is like a realm where the internal representations are, generally speaking, like fairly elegant but not very hedonic. So essentially very complex representations with a lot, like the information tracking is very, very accurate and is very detailed and a lot of capability for complexity. So it's kind of like using gestalts and then stacking them together in order to form computing apparatus, or these gold Rubberg machines. And doing math, for example, like mathematicians, I would say, yeah, they kind of like need to be in the human realm a lot of the time. I mean, they might be in the Titan realm some of the time, for sure. But for a lot of the time, they might be kind of in the human realm because they're generating these like fairly somewhat anhedonic constructions that like can stack together and form these, you know, high level constructs. And when you have that, essentially, yeah, the very elegant, you know, the blissful experiences are going to be when you can reduce a lot of that complexity, or all of a sudden you have like emergent, you know, highly consonant configurations. And yeah, I mean, internally, it's going to be something that it's, you know, attitude, it's an orientation is towards, you know, calculating, and it values complexity. Okay, just to run quickly through the last ones. The God realm, essentially, yeah, everything is soft and consonant, and synergistically so. I mean, that's the thing I was mentioning, that like, if you boost pleasure enough, the pleasures start to interact with one another. I mean, it's like, just as in the hell realm, the gestalts like themselves interact and they form these, you know, amalgamations that are like worse and worse and worse. In the heaven world, in the God realm, the soft, beautiful, pleasant, you know, colorful representations, they stack together and they form these paradises where, yeah, there's like this spaciousness and freedom and sense of ease that comes with it. And yes, all of that is going to be constructed out of like very beautiful vibes at the very beginning, and like stacking gestalts that are made of very beautiful vibes. Yeah, so what is inside you when you're in the God realm? Well, there's a cornucopia of sensory delights. It's kind of, you have a attitude that facilitates and enhances pleasure. And yeah, that also can be anti-fragile to an extent. The last four are kind of like, I mean, they're fairly Buddhist in their interpretation, but essentially they're like voice hearers, essentially people who figure out how to kind of like defabricate the world, like, you know, use dark night of the soul or equanimity practices in order to defabricate the nonlinearities, the gestalts, and ultimately exit out of the realms. And yeah, essentially this is kind of the voice hearers are those who essentially listen to the teachings of people who know this stuff. So that would be kind of like coupling with, like, you're half kind of like in this world in one realm, but you have like another foot in like hearing somebody who has like fully defabricated the world, and you are kind of like coupled to that person, and that allows you to essentially slowly defabricate your realm. Then you also have the cause awakened ones, which is essentially people who bootstrapped defabrication, so like they figured it out on their own, our hats and people like that. Yeah, I mean, essentially here they will have kind of like a core of an defabrication algorithm. It could be Vipassana, it could be like, certain kind of shamatha breathing exercises, or an attitude, a way of seeing the world. And they bootstrap out of it. Like if they focus enough on it, all of a sudden, they can kind of use that as the self-organizing principle and defabricate their world. Now, bodhisattvas, I would say, they're kind of like soap molecules. Like one foot in one world, one foot in the other, but they're at a homeostatic level where essentially they have stabilized, like half kind of like fully defabricated and half fabricated, so they can interface with the other worlds. Essentially, these are, beings, as it were. People in a secular interpretation, they essentially live in a kind of a homeostatic vibe control environment that, part of their realm can get out of control for a little bit, but when that happens, they kind of like boost the defabrication component and vice versa. So they can remain engaged, they can remain like empathetic and understanding and, actually engaging and interacting with the vibes of the world without it getting caught up in them. And finally, the Buddhas, they are essentially, people, fourth path. We've talked about these kind of individuals, but essentially they live in a world that is like fully defabricated. They have like access to kind of like pure consciousness, fully, completely relaxed, completely, let go, completely dropping the ball from any tightness, from any of these non-linearities. And that would be, kind of like total vibe control in a way. And ability to not be swayed by any gestalt whatsoever. Now, all of these, obviously, those, the realms come from kind of, a religious, mystical interpretation. But my claim is that all of that will actually make sense with non-linear wave dynamics, non-linear wave computing. And also, like, understanding it that way will allow us to, essentially generate technology to facilitate this process and, allow us to not get so caught up in insane realms that oftentimes, it's nobody's like making them on purpose. They're kind of this emergent effect. Especially things like the Hell and the Titan realm are really sticky because essentially your attempts to get out of them fortify them. And like that's really terrible. And that's one of the reasons I think why, like, for example, 5-MeO DMT is so promising. That is, if you're really caught up in one of those realms, a 5-MeO DMT will show you like, wow, like every move that I have belongs to the matrix of things that reinforces the realm. So actually, I did not have like an exit. I needed this wave of equanimity to temporarily defabricate it and give me some sense of spaciousness so I can then kind of like bootstrap from there. So I'm very hopeful that that is going to be very, very, very good in the future. This also may kind of explain the mood effects that, for example, different mental or physiological problems may have, like heart disease or stomach upset or lung cancer or, bone disease and so on. They will be emitting their particular kinds of harsh vibes. And that over time can aggregate. I mean, that's why like chronic pain is like worse than acute pain, because it's going to be generating these like non-linearities. And the non-linearities will have a harsh vibe. You will create gestalts, and eventually you will generate a realm that is your realm of being a sufferer of chronic pain. And that's so bad, so sad and terrible, isn't it? So, essentially, I think we can figure all of this out. I'm very optimistic that the nervous system can be fixed. We can kind of exit this paradigm. I know it's possible because there are people who don't suffer from all these, like bugs that our nervous system have. And not only like, highly advanced meditators, like also like people who genetically kind of like are in a really good mood all the time. I think they probably just don't have kind of like harsh vibe generators inside them. And I'm very, very hopeful actually that like we could, essentially build a society and move in that direction. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of sanity. But hopefully we can cultivate it. And with that, thank you so much for listening and being here. And as I recently wrote in a tweet against social media, live, laugh, love, and maximize valence for all sentient beings. And with that, well, take care, everybody. See you next time. Ciao.